Pain is undeniably part of being a football fan. For the true fan, it is the constant taste of defeat, of near miss after near miss, that makes eventual victory all the more sweet. The footballing romantic comes back to watch after having their heart broken once again, with the oft-misplaced optimism that next time things will be different. Occasionally, that belief pays off, and you're given the ultimate reward for your loyalty, but more often than not, you're left with the inevitability of the cycle of heartache renewing itself for another season, another ride on the train of hope, final destination nowhere. The fact that you were there the whole time, unwavering, makes the eventual payoff, whatever it comes, if it ever comes, that is, that much more special. That's really why I don't understand those that support a club that just wins over and over and over again, because you're simply not experiencing the true depth of emotion that comes with being a football fan. And there's one club that in the last 20 years or so has, for me, embodied this spirit more than anyone else. With undeniable historical pedigree, they are the beating heart of a metropolitan area of 300,000. They have an unswervingly loyal fanbase. They are, by all quantifiable measurements, a massive club. But in recent times, they have known boundless suffering, exhibiting some of the most dramatic underperformances relative to a club of their size I have ever seen, especially on the European stage. Yet, each week, come rain, shine, or even snow, their supporters endure. This is the story of Hajduk Split. It's probably best to begin chronologically with a history lesson. Hajduk was founded in 1911 by a group of students who had just returned from their studies in Prague and decided that it was high time that their city of Split had a football club of its own. They took the name Hajduk from a kind of Balkan guerrilla fighter that existed during Ottoman rule over the region, a romanticised kind of Robin Hood-esque figure of local mythology that was famed for stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. Defiance was in the club's blood from the offset. They quickly established themselves as a footballing force during the span of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, especially during a golden period in the late 1920s. They were the only club from outside Belgrade and Zagreb to pick up silverware during this era, proudly representing the peripheral southern Croatian region of Dalmatia. During the Second World War, meanwhile, Split was annexed by Italy. The Italian authorities were impressed by their footballing prowess. In a meeting where representatives from the club bravely resisted saluting the Italians, they were offered a new stadium and an immediate place in Serie A. But this came with one condition, that the club would change their name to AC Spalato, which is the Italian name for Split. This was seen as an insult to the integrity and the identity of the club, and the offer was summarily rejected, flying in the face of military coercion. Having antagonised the regime, the club was forced to dismantle itself, and in doing so they hid all of their trophies and valuable assets in a patisserie oven, in hopes that one day normal service could be resumed. Hajduk became the club of the Croatian resistance. In 1944, they were reborn on the island of Vis, off the coast of the Adriatic, which was essentially the headquarters of Tito's partisans. With a selection of resistance players, they played a fixture against the British Army Select that included the legendary Tom Finney, in freshly liberated Bari that drew over 40,000 spectators, this making it one of the most watched games during the Second World War. They had a rapturous homecoming in liberated Split, then went on tour across Malta and the Middle East to drum up support, and boost morale during the ongoing campaign, playing 27 games in 100 days, and even dazzling Charles de Gaulle himself in Beirut. Due to their role here, when the war ended and the Yugoslav league resumed, they were the only club of major stature not to be disbanded due to their historical connections. They had even banked up so much credit that they were able to say no to pressure from the newly installed Titoist government. Hajduk, as the most famous club in the country, were asked to do the unthinkable and relocate to Belgrade to become the official club of the Yugoslav army. They resisted and were allowed to continue on as normal. Instead, Partizan Belgrade was born as the official club of the military. Iconoclasm was clearly at the heart of the club, resistance was key, and nobody could tell Hajduk what to do. The early 1950s were marvellous for the club. They were part of the Yugoslav Big Four, along with Dynamo, Red Star and Partizan, that would dominate the footballing landscape until the federation's eventual dissolution. They won the league 3 times, including an invincible season in 1950. They boasted Bernard Vukas, a dribbling pioneer who was retrospectively voted the greatest Croatian footballer of all time. They also had Vladimir Bera, a man who Lev Yashin called the greatest goalkeeper in the world. In the 50s, their famous, or now infamous, ultra group Torcida was founded, only to almost be instantly banned for nationalist expressions in a game against Red Star. They would operate in the shadows until re-emerging strongly during the 80s, and they now claim to be the oldest ultra group in the world. The 60s, though, were a bit of a different story. The club found itself in the midst of immense hardship, fighting relegation from the top flight on a regular basis. One particularly narrow escape came in 1964, where they avoided the drop by 2 points. Then, 2 seasons later, it would emerge that that season's survival was predicated on fraud. Hajduk had paid off FK Železničar of Sarajevo to throw the antepenultimate fixture of the season, a game which Hajduk won by 4-0. The footballing authorities ordered Hajduk to be administratively relegated. Hajduk's board and manager Milan Ciric were banned for life. The decision, though, to relegate the club almost sparked an insurrection in Split, and fearing for the stability of the nation and the political power that football possessed, the authorities overturned the decision, opting instead to give them a paltry points deduction. All was eventually forgiven, with Ciric as well, as he was allowed to come back to Yugoslavia and manage the national team in 1973. Then came the 70s, which were absolutely magical. Undoubtedly the greatest period in the history of the club. They won the Yugoslav Cup 5 times and the league 4 times. They cultivated a strong team that ended up little known outside of Yugoslavia due to the national team and Hajduk's shortcomings on the international stage. Players included captain and chief playmaker Jurica Jerkovic, infamous American indoor soccer defector Slaviša Žungl, who, I kid you not, had to change his name to Steve in America.
For Žungl, unselfish play, look at this. Big effort, Brecky on the intercept. Žungl may get a chance. Pumps it in. Steve Žungl.
There's the disco musician and drunk boating manslaughterer Ivica Šurjak and Branko Oblak, who many call the greatest Slovenian player of all time. The coaching talents of Tomislav Ivic were able to flourish. He was one of the first proponents of total football. He would eventually go on to manage a multitude of the world's top clubs, playing thrilling football all the while. It's perhaps unsurprising then that with their romantic total football style, that just like the Dutch, their international record would be replete with a series of heroic failures. Their European record in this time was perhaps a bit of a sign of things to come in the modern era. Brace yourself for the incoming pain. In 1972, they were in the European Cup. They were knocked out on away goals by Valencia. In 1973, Cup Winners' Cup semi-final, where they endured a battling defeat to Don Reevy's Leeds, which is still actually their best ever European result.
Prendre le ballon, Chouriac. Toujours Chouriac qui passe. Malgré. Oh là là, il est. Oh, le but super.
In 1975, they're in European Cup. They stuffed Saint-Étienne 4-1 at home, only to lose 5-1 after extra time away and get knocked out 6-5 on aggregate. In the 1976 European Cup quarter-final, they beat PSV 2-0 at home, only to lose 3-0 away, again after extra time. 1978, they're in the Cup Winners' Cup. They had a 2-2 draw of Austria Wien, and they were eliminated after missing every single penalty in a penalty shootout. 1979, they're in the UEFA Cup. They beat Arsenal 2-1 at home, and then they lost 1-0 at Highbury, and thus were knocked out on away goals. The 1980 European Cup quarter-final, they beat Kevin Keegan's Hamburg at the peak of their powers 3-2 at home, but then lost 1-0 away, and were knocked out on away goals. Ironically, Hamburg were managed by ex-Hajduk manager Branko Zebec. In 1982, they're in the UEFA Cup. They beat Valencia 4-1 at home, but then proceeded to lose 5-1 away and thus 6-5 on aggregate.
Još jedan gol, dajte momci sada. Naprijed je sada Cukrov iz daleka, gol! Bravo Cukrov!
In the 1983 UEFA Cup, they beat Bordeaux 4-1 at home, then they lost 4-0 away. It was 5-4 in aggregate, and they were knocked out. In 1984, they're in the UEFA Cup semi-final. They're knocked out by Spurs on away goals. They're then given a stadium ban for next year's Cup Winners' Cup due to a Hajduk fan running onto the pitch at half-time and killing a live cockerel. In 1986, they're in the UEFA Cup quarter-final, where they won 1-0 at home to Zulte Waregem. They then lost 1-0 away and were knocked out on penalties. Then, in the 1988 Cup Winners' Cup, they forfeited their second round tie against Marseille due to fans letting off tear gas bomb, and thus were banned from UEFA competitions for 2 whole seasons. Well, along with those European struggles, the 80s were a lot more fallow domestically for Hajduk. They were there or thereabouts, but they won a handful of cups and did not win a single league title. Partizan and Red Star dominated, and even FCAS Sarajevo and Vojvodina got in on the act. With the cracks in the federation exposed by insurgent nationalist sentiment after the death of Tito, Yugoslavia was thrown into political tumult, and football became an expression of the latent ethnic tensions that were about to explode in tragic circumstances. Hajduk were less of a lightning rod for nationalistic expression than Franjo Tudjman's adopted Dynamo or the Serbian nationalist-infused Red Star, but trouble still flared in the ugly final few seasons of the Yugoslav League, as a 1990 match in particular against Partizan was abandoned due to Hajduk fans burning the Yugoslav Federation's flag. On the 8th of May 1991, the last showpiece of unified Yugoslav football took place. This was the final of the Marshal Tito Cup. Hajduk were to play the European champions Red Star Belgrade. The build-up could not have been more tense, with Croatia right on the cusp of seceding from Yugoslavia. A limited audience of 7,000 intrepid spectators were allowed into the Partizan Stadium to witness the last hurrah of Yugoslav football. Alan Bokšić scored a slaloming solo goal to give Hajduk a 1-0 win in a game marred by a brawl between players in the second half that saw Igor Stimac and the late Snisha Mihailovic dismissed. Hajduk got to keep the Marshal Tito trophy forever, and it still sits in their cabinet to this very day. And so, Yugoslav football was finished. This was the end. Ironically, in terms of standard, this was it at its very strongest, its very peak. A 90s unified Yugoslav team had scary potential. It could have easily won a major trophy. After all, their youth team won the Under-20 World Cup in 1987. The backbone of that cup-winning Hajduk side was pretty remarkable when you consider they're all part of the very same generation. It's a bit of a who's who of that wonderful Croatian side that came third in the 1998 World Cup, and within a whisker of the final in that edition of the tournament. You had Igor Stimac, you had Slaven Bilic, Alan Bocic, and Robert Jarni. Here's the kicker. As Croatia declared independence, players were no longer obligated to stay and play the domestic game until they were of a mature age where they are allowed to move. The Yugoslav League also boasted the pick of the teams from all over the federation, but as it fractured into multiple smaller entities, the quality of the game became diluted significantly overnight. Football was also essentially privatised. It became a business rather than a state operation, and all sorts of characters emerged from the shadows to try and make some money from the beautiful game, all in spite of some false pretenses of public or city or fan ownership in the former Yugoslav game. Add to the equation the tumultuous political situation and imminent warfare, and what you get next is obvious: a fire sale, a migration of all talent, and a region that has not recovered at club level ever since, and it will probably never reach those great heights ever again. Quite ironic in the end, I think. All four of those players that I previously mentioned were pretty much immediately shepherded on after that cup triumph. Hajduk rode the wave of being the strongest team at the time of the dissolution, on their way to winning 3 of the first 4 Croatian league titles after the dissolution of Yugoslavia, and they even stuttered into the quarterfinals of the 1994-95 Champions League, where they were comprehensively beaten by Ajax of Amsterdam. Then, for 5 seasons, they won absolutely nothing, as Dynamo, playing under their short-lived and controversial name of Croatia Zagreb, took 5 titles in a row. At the turn of the century then, Hajduk experienced a mini revival, but this was more down to Dynamo entering an awkward transitional era than Hajduk's excellence, as they ummed and ahed to the 2001, 2004 and 2005 league titles. The latter of the 3 epitomised this. Dynamo Zagreb did so badly in the first half of the season that they are put in the relegation group when the season split into 2 halfway through. Hajduk won the league with just 56 points from 32 games against abysmal opposition, securing the title on the last day with a 6-0 victory over Vartex, a club whose manager had already agreed to join Hajduk next season, which naturally raised a few eyebrows, especially with Dynamo fans. Organisationally, the club was a mess and chronically mismanaged. They nearly went bankrupt in 2001, only for a generous donation from a collective of ex-players to save them. Slaven Bilic himself called the money he gave to the club probably the worst investment ever. Igor Stimac tried to take the reins in the boardroom, but only ended up ruining his legacy with the club's fans. The cracks were shown for many years prior, but it was here, in the mid-2000s, where the era of pain, and more pain truly began for Hajduk. 20 years of it and counting. Before we get into that, however, I feel like it's necessary to explore the relationship between Hajduk and Dynamo Zagreb, because it is an endlessly fascinating one. When you read sentiment about it now, one would imagine them being sworn enemies since the advent of each club. Encounters in recent times between the two have been punctuated by violence, especially that which is perpetrated by their 2 respective ultra groups, the aforementioned Torcida and the Bad Blue Boys, respectively. It's certainly a far cry from the archetypal modern European footballing spectating experience when you look at some of these incidents, and a throwback to the bad old days of the 1980s. The moniker Wieczny derby, the eternal derby, suggests a permanence to this animosity and the hatred that has blossomed between these two sides. But the reality is that before the foundation of the HNL Liga in 1992, this was an extremely peaceful matchup, even a friendly one. Slaven Bilic speaks of the encounter between the two sides being a celebration of Croatian national identity, where the fans would sing together. And he contrasts this with saying that he would be afraid to bring his son to a modern derby between the two. Other sources on the issue back this up accordingly. As Jonathan Wilson writes, if rivalry does not exist, it must be invented. The animosity of this derby was a necessity for supporters of each club to keep passion and interest in the game alive. And let's face it, because some ultras are pretty much involved in football for the wrong reasons. No longer playing the unified subjects of hate in Red Star and Partizan each year, they ended up turning on each other, and the derby has become a different expression of hatred that operates on a more micro level. In his academic paper, Dustin Tsai writes that the eternal derby has become an expression of a regional north-south divide in Croatia between the ostensibly more sophisticated and metropolitan Zagreb and the wilder and more economically disadvantaged Dalmatia. On the surface, it's not too dissimilar to the oft-cited divide in Italy between, say, Milan and Naples. Subtle societal tensions that bubble under the surface in everyday life are brought to the forefront under the guises of football, which isn't surprising when the two clubs involved wield more power with the population than political parties and trade unions, and have the ability to influence both elections and the legal system in Croatia. Testimony from spectators on Derby Day exhibits the fashion in which some residents of Zagreb look down upon their counterparts from Split. One invokes the S word, that being Serbian, when speaking about the Dalmatian accent, likening it to something foreign. On the other hand, a Dalmatian worker says that the casual prejudice she is treated with in Zagreb can turn dangerous on the day of the eternal derby. Perhaps then this qualifies just how passionate Hajduk fans feel about their club as a representative of themselves and of the very area that they hail from, a source and an object of pride. One fan states that Dynamo is just a club team that people cheer for. Hajduk is our religion. That is the difference. We were born Torcida and Hajduk is in our blood. It is a part of who we are as people. Everyone in Split likes Hajduk, and there is no separating that. And he's not wrong either. Despite being a significantly smaller city, Hajduk Split fetches double the average attendance of Dynamo, clocking in at over 20,000 a game. This is in the context of a wider Eastern European region where domestic football is often on life support and practically empty stadiums are the norm rather than the exception. And it's all the more remarkable when you see the calibre of some of the teams coming to town. Varaždin, Velika Gorica, Rudeš, Slaven Belupo, etc. This is a massive turnout by all means. This team means everything to the people of Split, who turn out in droves no matter what, whereas with Dynamo, with all of their recent success, the city of Zagreb could take it or leave it. There's a reason why the club's badge is plastered all over the city of Split. The rivalry has also been exacerbated by the total domination of the past 20 years of domestic football by Dynamo and the fashion in which they have monopolised the Croatian game. Dynamo have dwarfed Hajduk's investment, often through legally grey means, thanks to their notorious ex-executive director Zdravko Mamic. Their production of talent has been ridiculous, whereas Hajduk's has slowed to a crawl. Sure, they produced Igor Tudor in the 90s and to a lesser extent Stipe Pletikosa, Dario Serna and Kalinic, but you look at that compared to Dynamo, who have had Vardiol, Olmo, Modric, Mandzukic, Chorluka, Lovren, Kovacic, Eduardo, etc., etc. They've just continued to expand and expand, choking the other teams in the league, who are already at a great disadvantage, completely out of the equation. And their sales-based model means that the overall standard of domestic football in the country is heavily compromised, as the most talented youngsters barely get a chance to ply their craft before being shipped off. Let's get back to Hajduk more generally, shall we? 04-05 season is where it all began to go horribly wrong. As reigning champions, they entered the second qualifying round of the Champions League, where they drew Dublin's very own Shelbourne, who were then on the verge of bankruptcy themselves. A shaky home leg saw them fall behind before securing an underwhelming 3-2 victory. Surely they could hold out at Talca Park though. You'd be wrong there. A late 1-2 punch from Dave Rogers and Alan Moore said no, and the Minnows remarkably marched on to the third qualifying round. Then, at the same stage in the following season's Champions League, they lost 8-0 on aggregate to Hungary's Debrecen, who would then go on to lose in the next round themselves 6-0. Hajduk came 5th in the league with just 40 points, which is 36 fewer than Dynamo's tally. This started a long period of being domestically blown out of the water by Dynamo, who proceeded to win the league 11 times in a row from here on in. Their dominance was only broken by the unlikely figure of Heinka Rijeka, whose Italian owner Gabriele Volpi pumped a ton of money into the club, won the title in 2017, and then immediately sold the club thereafter. After many precarious years financially, where the club haplessly chased the tail of Dynamo, getting nowhere close in the process and throwing good money after bad, nearly driving the club to extinction in the process, fans took matter into their own hands and formed a democratic body called Nash Hajduk, which translates to Our Hajduk in 2011. This aims to implement a socios model at the club, where the club's supervisory groups of administrators is elected democratically by members of the club. This group then selects the club president or chairman. Through crowdfunding, the fan organisation, through its humble beginnings, has managed to gradually buy out more and more shares of the club, accumulating a greater percentage year on year. They presently own just over 30% of the club's shares, with the majority stake being held by the city of Split itself. Having been so close to extinction, the club became a much more modest entity in the early 2010s. Club legend Igor Tudor was at the helm of a side filled with youth players on a shoestring budget, and he guided them to the Croatian Cup in a 5-4 aggregate win over Lokomotiva Zagreb after Dynamo crashed out in the round of 16 to the now extinct Zadar. The ensuing years were very difficult though, as Rijeka soared amidst their new investment, and Hajduk sat in a distant 3rd, 4th or even 5th. But at least the fans could take satisfaction in the fact that their club were doing things very much their way, even if that doesn't involve inordinate amounts of money. Pride in the club would continue to grow hand in hand with attendances. In 2021-22, there's a real sense of turning a corner. Hajduk came 2nd in the league and were within touching distance of Dynamo the whole way through. They also won the cup, again through avoiding Dynamo, but still, a win is a win. Next season was pretty much an identical experience. The ultimate prize, the league title, now felt truly tangible if things went their way. Going into the 2024-25 season, they had finished below Dynamo 20 times in a row, but this year felt different. Under new boss Gennaro Gattuso, there was a very difficult start to the season. A bitter fallout with new signing and national team legend Ivan Perisic led to the former Internazionale winner terminating his contract after just a single league appearance. But then the clouds began to part and things were looking up. Dynamo themselves were in disarray, 7 points off the top at the halfway mark. Rijeka and Hajduk locked horns at the top. Hajduk led early on, then ceded to Rijeka for a significant period of time. Hajduk were back on top on matchday 21, but they then immediately slipped up against Istra and fell back to second. They rebounded on matchday 25, but then got stuffed 3-0 by their title rivals and fell back again. It was all still in their grasp, however, and 2 wins on the trot took them back to the summit. But then the pressure got to them. A nightmare run of just 2 points from their next 5 games, topped off by an emphatic loss to Dynamo. This surely would have spelled the end in any normal season, but somehow, after all of that, Rijeka had only pulled 3 points clear. Dynamo were stalking and came from nowhere to slot into second, just a point behind. A draw against Gorlice in the anti-penultimate game of the season, however, was a bridge too far, and Hajduk had completely bottled their one golden chance. Rijeka stumbled over the line to a most unlikely second Croatian crown, edging Dynamo on head-to-head as they both finished level on just 65 points. Naturally, when it didn't count, Hajduk won their last 2 games and finished third, closing out the season on 63 points. It was an agonising year after everything they had been through, and they were mocked mercilessly by their Zagrebian counterparts. Last season then, normal service resumed, and Dynamo blasted to yet another title. Let's go back then to qualifying, my somewhat clickbait title, and move on to what actually motivated me to make this video in the first place: Hajduk's European record in the last few seasons. We've already seen the golden era of comical collapses and heroic defeats. We talked briefly about Shelburne and the humbling at the hands of Debrecen. Well, you haven't seen anything yet, my friend. Just you wait and see. This is possibly the most torrid European record for a club of this size you'll ever see. Since 2011, they have simply been unable to advance past the qualifying stage of the Europa League and Conference League. The first major humiliation comes in 2013 when they were beaten home and away by the unknown Georgian side Dila Gori. In 2012 they lost a leg against the now defunct Skonto Liga. In 2014 they lost legs against Dundalk and Shakhtar Karagandhi before being knocked out by the also defunct Dnipropetrovsk. 4 seasons in a row they failed to make it to the Europa League proper without any serious embarrassment. But here is where it gets a lot worse. In 2019, they're drawn against Maltese side Gezira United in front of 600 fans in Takali, essentially the opposite end of nowhere in Malta. They carve out a routine 2-0 victory. 19,000 fans show up for the return fixture in Split, and they rejoice after 7 minutes as Basel Girardi puts them 3-0 up in the tie. Then in the second half, Gezira get one back through Jefferson, and then another through Kone. Embarrassing, yes, but surely nothing more to come of it. Roll on the 90th minute +6, where Ben Kone unleashes a venomous strike to win the tie through the Uber Minnows on away goals. The Ivorian could scarcely believe what he had even done. The crowd were utterly silenced in one of the most embarrassing moments in Hajduk's history. In 2020-21, they are thrown out of the Europa League by Galatasaray. Fair enough. Then UEFA brings in the Conference League for the first time, and this presents a legitimate chance for Hajduk to actually qualify for something. They go straight into the second qualifying round in a draw against the Kazakhstani side Tobol. They won the first leg at home 2-0, but guess what happens next? They concede 3 goals in the span of 10 minutes away from home, and are on their way out, only for Emir Sahiti to salvage the tie in the dying minutes. Phew, blushes spared. Unlucky for them though, that away goals had been abolished by now. But surely they'll kick on and take the lifeline and go on to win the tie. Well, I'm afraid not. They squandered this completely, and again it was courtesy of an absolute streamer, although I think the keeper really should have done a lot better. It was embarrassment and embarrassment again. Fast forward then to the 24-25 Conference League, and we go straight into the second round. HB Tórshavn of the Faroe Islands were beaten 2-0 over 2 legs. A solid start. The third round brings a favourable draw. MFK Ružomberok, a tiny Slovak club. They draw 0-0 in Slovakia, and 27,000 fervent supporters pack in to Stadion Poljud for the return leg, with high hopes that their boys can do it. They must do it. They don't do it. They wilt under the pressure, conceding a comical own goal after 7 minutes. Ružomberok parked the bus and held out to win 1-0 against a side which had Ivan Rakitic in its squad. Surely this couldn't keep happening. 2025-26, and it's Dynamo Tirana in the third qualifying round of the Conference League. It took extra time to beat Zira of Azerbaijan, but Hajduk held out, so surely that's the shakiness for this year out of the way. Albanian club drew first blood in the first leg in Split, but Hajduk composed themselves and bite back 2-1 in front of 32,000 supporters. Dynamo scored early on again in Tirana and ended up holding out for extra time. But then Australia's very own Karacic put Hajduk ahead. But then, the unthinkable, they shipped 2 in quick succession in extra time in what should have been closed out as an easy win. A 4-3 loss on aggregate, and it seems as if a curse is on the heads of Hajduk. Maybe it was the club name Dynamo Tirana that got to them. We then come to this season, courtesy of their distant second place in the HNL Liga. Hajduk were given their first chance to qualify for the Europa League since the establishment of the third tier Conference League. With entry to the first qualifying round, they would need to win 4 ties if their dream of reaching the main phase was to come true. They came up against old foe Žilina, who they lost to in 2009. Hajduk produced a characteristic home performance, winning 2-0, and then survived a late scare away in Slovakia via another comedy own goal to prevail 3-2 on aggregate in the end. Marching on then to the second round, and Hajduk ended up drawing Paphos, who you may remember from the league phase of last season's UEFA Champions League. It was certainly not the easiest tie, as the Cypriot club are no slouches themselves, a solid team with a very distinct Lusophone flavour, also with David Luiz at the back. The first leg was at Poljud, and Hajduk would aim to make a strong impression. And that they did, taking a fairly deserved 2-0 victory at home. They played the Cypriots off the park with a free kick from Michele Szego and a well-worked goal rounded off by Mario Melniak, sealing the deal. To sweeten matters for fans, Dynamo struggled that same week in the first leg of their Champions League encounter, away to the Swiss Leicester City FC Thun, where they were lucky to nab a 1-1 draw. So, going into the second leg, there's an uncharacteristic sense of optimism around the club. Despite the achievements of Paphos, the away trip wasn't exactly one to be particularly intimidated by. The club is a bit of a strange entity. A more cynical person might even call them plastic, being newly founded, operating off questionable Russian investment, and possessing a small supporter base. Furthermore, with their own ground not being up to UEFA standards, they have to play their home games an hour away in Limassol. Only 4,000 spectators showed up to this second leg, and a lot of them were actually Hajduk fans. It wasn't exactly an intimidating environment for Hajduk to sit upon a 2-0 lead. But then, the game got underway. Hajduk leaned a bit too much into sitting on their advantage. They played on the back foot and invited pressure onto themselves. Paphos didn't make any gilt-edged chances, but it was still all one-way traffic. A free header from David Goldar from a corner was a warning sign, and then, just before half-time, the ball broke to Duda, who unleashed a fearsome first-time effort from the edge of the area. The deficit had been halved. It would be a nervy second half. Goldar again came close from a header, then Kina's spectacular overhead effort went over the bar. Hajduk were still doing a good job of slowing the game down and limiting Paphos, but time ran slowly and they still had 10 minutes to kill. Then Goldar finally nodded home from a set piece. Despair for Hajduk. But then came the reprieve of the whistle from the referee. The goal was justifiably disallowed for an elbow in the build-up. A huge let-off. This could well be Hajduk's day. They withstood a few more scrambles in the area and they made it to additional time. Just 3 additional minutes were added on. They just had to cling on. But then a corner was taken quickly and worked short. A curling diagonal cross from Beale is met by the head of Goldar, who finally gets his goal that looked like it was coming all game. The despair etched onto the faces of the Hajduk players gave a sense that they had already lost, even with extra time to come, and the outcome was inevitable. Just 2 minutes into extra time, Silic spills and Beale pounces on the rebound. Hajduk have no fight left in them at this point, and whilst haplessly chasing an equaliser, Paphos break down the other end and walk it in. 4-2. 4-0 on the night, a pitiful final blow and another chapter in the endless European pain of Hajduk. The team timidly addressed the visiting supporters from the halfway line, whilst head coach Garcia insisted that the defeat actually wasn't that bad, or that it wasn't indicative of a mentality problem at the club, which I find a little bit questionable. Add insult to injury, earlier that week their fans watched on as Dynamo did the same thing in reverse. There would have been smiles on the faces of fans in Split as they went 2-0 down to FC Thun at half-time, but then they executed a miraculous turnaround in the last 15 minutes to take the game to extra time, where Maris Valinic scored a vital winning goal and sent them through to the next round of the UEFA Champions League qualifiers. Once again, the yin and yang effect between Hajduk and Dynamo continues. One seems to get their meaning from the other, and the big dogs of Dynamo seem to thrive from the suffering and the trauma of Hajduk, as they became the butt of all Croatian jokes once again for their European performance. So, what now? Well, not all hope is lost, because Hajduk will continue in the third qualifying round of the Conference League. And I joked a bit about the fates of Hajduk and Dynamo being intertwined, so you'll love this. Not only do both sides travel to Lithuania for their next qualifying game, but both will be playing clubs that have the same name. Dynamo will be playing Žalgiris of Kaunas, while Hajduk are playing Žalgiris of Vilnius. You really couldn't make that up, could you? These are famous last words, but this is such a winnable encounter for Hajduk, especially with a second leg at home. If they win this, then they're through to the final qualifying round, and who knows what can happen then. The defeat to Paphos naturally brought a great deal of negativity and cynicism to the club, especially given how inevitable the occurrence feels at this stage of Hajduk buckling under pressure, of capitulating, of giving up their lead. I had a quick peruse of the Hajduk subreddit along with Twitter, Facebook and YouTube comments, and with it being a Balkan online space and all, the atmosphere does feel a little bit toxic. There are many fans that are braying for private ownership and investment in the club and an overhaul of the current model. Apparently the club were sizing up investment from Ukrainian sources earlier this year, and this is fresh on the minds of fans who see the gap between themselves and their sworn rivals grow ever larger. At the start of Nash Hajduk, an American consortium offered to take over. This was kind of unilaterally rejected, but if that same offer was tabled today, maybe fans would have a different answer. But for me, contrary to the old Danny Blanchflower quote that was written all around White Hart Lane, the game is not just about glory. I know that's difficult to see for a lot of people, but if you boil football down to just success, you lose so much of what the game is actually about. I know that it's difficult to see when you're subjected to so much recurrent pain and heartbreak, but surely gaining parity through pumping money into the club is a hollow victory, especially for a club that has been so resilient, still standing after enduring so much political upheaval and being so insistent on doing its own thing in doing so. Something is lost in a club when this happens. Just take Newcastle United, for instance, with their Saudi Arabian takeover. A lot of self-proclaimed fans don't think in these terms, I know, especially with online debates and discourse these days. And the most remarkable thing for me is this attitude nestles right down into, Sunday, Saturday league amateur football, where people will rile themselves up for the first few games of the season, their local club, they're playing for their parish, and if they start losing, they just stop turning up. And the team that had 25, 30 lads to pick from at the start of the season, they're playing a bare 11 and they can't pull a team together. It's kind of bizarre how far that attitude trickles down. I think it is innate human nature in a way, and I think maybe I'm just a suffering romantic at heart when it comes to football. Maybe there's an overly romanticized view of the game from me that other people don't share, and maybe that's just unique in how I see what is ultimately a sport at the end of the day. But what is for certain, though, is that there's no way that a club of this stature, drawing this many spectators, should have gone so long without making it to the main stage of a European competition, especially with the Conference League as it is now. We've seen clubs in the competition from Gibraltar, Kosovo, North Macedonia, Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland and Malta in recent times. Hajduk can surely make it into that company sooner rather than later. This time, I have belief that they will make it. This is the time. And for a long-suffering fan base, a club doing things the right way, just a taste of the league phase would be so sweet. Let's hope that in my prediction that I'm not proven wrong. Thank you for watching if you got this far, and hopefully I'll catch you again shortly.